When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, I could not be shaken.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Unshaken. I'm Jared Halverson, and I really hope that you have recovered from last week. Now, there are marathons, and then there are ultra marathons, and last week was an ultra marathon. We covered so much material, and it only took us 7.5 hours to do it. So I really hope that you took advantage of technology to speed up things. I know some of you do that. I've met someone in person, and they always say, yeah, when we're speaking face to face, man, you sound slow. Because I'm used to cranking you up to time and a half or double speed if I need to get through more material. And last week was definitely one of those weeks. If you didn't have time to get through everything, no blame from my end. But a couple of things that I really hope you'll go back and cover if you didn't get a chance. Obviously, David and Bathsheba is absolutely essential to understand. And we saw some detail there that I hope will help you understand even deeper what went wrong there. How he got into that mess and how we can hopefully stay out of similar ones ourselves. Fast forward a little bit, and I hope you spent time with Amnon and Tamar. Their story is a forgotten one, sadly, in Scripture. And yet I don't know of better evidence of reaping the wind or sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind, for David, that is, than the story of his two children, Amnon and Tamar. And then David and Absalom, another story that really is worth your attention in terms of reconciling frayed relationships. If you're struggling on either end of that, either you're having a hard time forgiving someone and letting them back into your life, or you're trying and the other person just won't reciprocate. The story of David and Absalom, in terms of not just a parable of a prodigal son, but a history of one that butts up a little bit against somewhat of a prodigal father in that instance as well. So that one's worth studying. And then the second half of last week's lesson with King Solomon, his wisdom. If you wanted to get past the surface level of these two women fighting over the baby, we talked about some important things. And then particularly the temple of Solomon, the dedicatory prayer, so many amazing things in that first half of First Kings. Now, as long as last week's lesson was, the 7.5 hour ultra marathon, it was actually way shorter than it should have been or would have been if we were really going to cover every single chapter in the Scriptures that coincided with that time period. Because this is where we get the overlap or the repetition between the books of Samuel and Kings and the books of Chronicles. Chronicles in some ways is a second version. It's kind of like the Synoptic Gospels in the New Testament, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically tell much of the same story. John is off doing his own thing, but trying to analyze or understand the ministry of Jesus Christ from slightly different angles. And that's the case with the books of Chronicles. First and Second Chronicles don't show up anywhere at all in the Come Follow Me curriculum for the year, and I think that's tragic. So if we really wanted to cover all of what we were going to learn about David and Solomon, beyond everything we saw last week, we'd have to add another 29 chapters. All of the rest or the vast majority of First Chronicles and the first 9 chapters or so of Second Chronicles. And so 7.5 hours was nothing. I don't know what you're complaining about. I was taking it easy on you. Now, what I want to do, though, is at least give you an introduction to the Books of Chronicles and give you a few highlights from it that are worth holding on to. And then just leave you with the encouragement that if you've never read the Old Testament cover to cover in its entirety, then I would suggest this is your year and encourage you to actually push yourself through First and Second Chronicles. And right about now is the best time to do it, because it will ring some bells on what we've been talking about last week and what we'll talk about for the next 2 weeks. So here's the simple version. First and Second Chronicles is a secondary history of Israel. The first history we have starts in Genesis and goes through Esther. But the Chronicles version starts in Genesis as well. It begins with Adam. But the first 9 chapters are primarily just rapid-fire genealogy to get us up to speed to the part of Israelite history that the chronicler really wanted to focus on, which were the reigns of the kings, namely Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, Saul only gets one quick token chapter because the real focus is on David. And David is going to get pretty much everything in 1 Chronicles from chapter 10 all the way to the end in chapter 29. 2 Chronicles then begins and covers the reign of Solomon. That's about the first 9 chapters or so. And then everything beyond that in 2 Chronicles will coincide with the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah, which is what we'll see today and next week and the week after. Okay? Now, the simplest way, I think, to watch the overlap would be to take the 4 books that we've been covering, Samuel, Kings, and this is an overgeneralization or oversimplification, but those 4 books basically line up with Saul, David, Solomon, and everybody else. That's not perfectly matched, but close enough, okay, for our purposes. And then, like I said, you take 1st and 2nd Chronicles and map it over that, and 1st Chronicles is David, 2nd Chronicles is Solomon, and the rest. And so we're going to be spending some time today in the second half of 1 Kings and bringing in some things from 2 Chronicles to round out the story. Why do you need both histories, and why do we tend to skip over the second one? Like I said, most of 1st and 2nd Chronicles are stories that you're already familiar with. There are a few big ones that we'll cover today that are completely absent in the story of Kings. But the main difference, as far as scholars are concerned, is that the Books of Chronicles are a more positive approach to the history we already saw in Samuel and Kings. For example, last week we spent some difficult time with David and Bathsheba. In Chronicles, we meet David. We spent all kinds of time with him, but we never meet Bathsheba. That is kind of, let's not talk about that, okay? Let's just move right on. We don't see the story of Amnon and Tamar. There's no rebellion from Absalom. It's just David has this incredible reign, everything's wonderful, and then he passes the baton to Solomon, who also has an incredible reign and is wise and builds the temple, and we never see Solomon's downfall in the Books of Chronicles either. Now, some would simply say, oh, is this just whitewashed history then? This is the version that people, in some ways Israel's like, or David and Solomon are, please don't read Samuel and Kings. Please read Chronicles. We look awesome there. Well, they look awesome in Samuel and Kings as well, but they do, it's a more human version. You see those mistakes. I think it's interesting to watch people study church history. And the series Saints, I think, is a great example of still having this incredibly inspiring story of our history, but also recognizing that there are human fingerprints all over it. As I've said before, I think too often we grow up thinking that church history is 100% divinity and 0% humanity. And then as soon as we see some problems, we overcorrect and think that it's all humanity and no divinity and end up leaving the church. It doesn't need to be that way. We need to understand that people are human, both in the past as well as in the present. And we need to cut some people some slack and not hold them to some kind of standard that only the Son of God has ever lived up to. And I think because we're used to the Samuel and Kings version, we should be okay with some humanity in church history. Maybe for too long, we've been studying the Chronicles version. And we need to be able to grapple and wrestle and deal with the Samuel and Kings version of our own history as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It will still be incredibly inspiring, believe me. It is. But in some ways, it might even be more inspiring because it admits its own humanity, which we all have to grapple with, okay? Now, the other thing about this is if Chronicles is not simply some kind of whitewashed history, then why are those things missing? Here's the simplest or the most basic way I can explain it. Most scholars believe that the books of Samuel and Kings were written at the beginning or sometime during the Babylonian captivity. There would have been sources from before that, and a lot of them are mentioned on the page, but in terms of coming to its final shape the way we have it in the Hebrew Bible, would be sometime during that Babylonian captivity. And in some ways it's this sense of, how did we get here? What a mess that we're in. We're supposed to be the people of God, a chosen nation, a kingdom of priests, and here we are in Babylonian captivity. And the history behind that, getting up to that point in the stories of Saul and David and Solomon and all these other kings of Judah and Israel, kind of explains the problem. It's like, oh, well, we kept forgetting God. No wonder we're here. We kept turning against the commandments and disobeying them and falling from grace. And where do you end up when that's the case? In bondage, in Babylon. And here we are. Now, the Books of Chronicles, then, scholars believe, were written after the Babylonian captivity was over and the Israelites had been allowed to come back home. We'll see all of this in the next couple of weeks as we go through more Israelite history. But once they're home, then we still want to learn our history. We still want to study it and teach it to our children. And it's not that we're trying to whitewash it. The other version is there too. But we're trying to give our people hope that we have a future. And it will grow out of a glorious past if we are faithful to the commandments of God. So if the earlier version was kind of a we should have seen this coming version, or a God didn't abandon us, we abandoned him version of their history, then this second version from the chronicler is to reassure the people that righteousness will still bring the blessings of heaven. There's still hope ahead. God is forgiving and will be there for us. Our punishment is past and we can now move forward. So let's take what we studied last week about David and about Solomon, and let's just do, by way of quick review, I don't want to belabor the points here, but there are just some principles worth seeing. Let's review some of that history through the lens of the chronicler, and that will build some momentum so we can dive into this week's material, which will be focused in 1 Kings, but we'll get a few added insights from the chronicler as well. So back to King David, our hero of the story last week. This verse comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 12, and this is when David is being anointed king in Hebron. This is verse 38. All these men of war that could keep rank came with a perfect heart to Hebron to make David king over all Israel. And all the rest also of Israel were of one heart to make David king. Now, we saw that last week. David was ordained or anointed king in Hebron and served there for 7 years before he was anointed king over all Israel and served 33 more years in Jerusalem. This was more, I'm king of Judah and eventually will be king of Israel. This one from the very beginning seems to conflate the two and just speak of all Israel coming with one heart to make him king. But the detail I love most is where it says they could keep rank. And they came with a perfect heart and anointed him king with one heart. So there's this unity and this perfection, not perfect behavior, but a perfect heart in terms of we want to honor him whom God has called to be king. And the idea of being able to keep rank, if you've ever seen a military march, in terms of military precision, it's amazing to see just how disciplined everyone is. Equidistant from one another and everyone in lockstep. Now, I'm not saying anything against diversity. We need that too, right? Conquer the promised land and then go east of the Jordan, that's fine. But in terms of getting behind those that God has called as his mouthpieces upon the earth, living prophets and apostles, can we do a better job of keeping rank? I'm not saying that we pass off our need to think for ourselves. That's not the case. But to come and gain testimonies for ourselves, that these are God's anointed, and that whether by my own voice or the voice of my servants, it is the same, then I think there's power in keeping rank and in coming together with one heart and trying to perfect that heart in terms of following God's marching orders. In the next chapter, 1 Chronicles chapter 13, this is when David decides, let's bring the ark up to Jerusalem. Remember that story? Then Uzzah steadies it and so on. The same story is told here in 1 Chronicles. But notice this added detail in chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. And David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds, and with every leader. You see, he's involving others, getting buy-in from those he was leading. David's not just pulling ranks, saying this is what we're going to do. So he's counseling, he's consulting. And David said unto all the congregation of Israel, if it seem good unto you. So here he's honoring their agency. And that it be of the Lord our God. So there he's seeking inspiration to confirm that choice. If those two things line up, agency and inspiration, then let us send abroad unto our brethren everywhere, that they may gather themselves unto us. And let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we inquired not at it in the days of Saul. No wonder they went astray. That's such an interesting admission. There it was. We just didn't go. We didn't seek the Lord's counsel or guidance. And then he ends, and all the congregation said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. This is a monarchy functioning with certain elements of democracy. And I love the leadership style that David shows there. I love that he's not just saying my way or the highway, but consulting. I love that he's presenting an option, his best thinking, but wants buy-in from those that he's leading. And again, that he's honoring and trying to balance agency and inspiration. Let's see if our thoughts coincide with the Lord's thoughts, and then move forward together. And turn to the Lord in ways that were not done in the previous generation. That's already a marked improvement over what happened during the days of Saul. How about this next detail? 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 15. This is part of that beautiful Psalm of David that we studied last week in 2 Samuel chapter 22. A few added lines here. From verse 15, be ye mindful always of his covenant, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations. Oh, if there's a phrase worthy of a plaque somewhere or a needle point, be mindful always of his covenant. Is that something that's always on our mind? We promise to, every time we partake of the sacrament, to always remember him, to be willing to take his name upon us, to keep his commandments. This is keeping our eyes fixed on the covenant, to be mindful always. Or this phrase later in that same psalm, this is verse 29. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Is holiness beautiful to us? Or do we look for beauty in unholy places? To me, I don't know if there's a better description of the temple than that. A place to worship God in the beauty of holiness. What's it say in gold, etched in stone outside the temple? Holiness to the Lord. Well, there's nothing more beautiful than that. Fast forward, 1 Chronicles 20, verse 1 and 2. This is now where we get to the story in 2 Samuel where David sees Bathsheba. You'll recognize some of these phrases from our study last week, but you'll also see what is dramatically missing here. It came to pass that after the year was expired, at the time that kings go out to battle. Remember that phrase from last week's version? But that's all it is. At the time that kings go out to battle, Joab led forth the power of the army and wasted the country of the children of Ammon and came and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried at Jerusalem. Now this is where we shift to the story of David and Bathsheba, but not here in Chronicles. The next verse here says, and Joab smote Rabbah and destroyed it. So no mention of what's going on back in Jerusalem on the rooftop. And David took the crown of their king from off his head and found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there were precious stones in it, and it was set upon David's head. And he brought also exceeding much spoil out of the city. And that's all we get. No hint of what David has just done and gone through. And to me, if we add that verse to what we studied last week, it adds a level of poetic irony, literary irony, if we can call it that, because as a result of this battle that Joab won, David received a crown from an enemy king, heavy with gold, precious stones all around it, all kinds of spoil. But the real tragedy here is, yes, David, you gained an earthly crown that day. But because of what you did, you lost a heavenly one. Now, it's not over for David. And when we get to the Psalms and get to see his heart, I'm saving it for that. We'll wrestle with what is said about David in Doctrine and Covenants 132. We'll try to understand what his future holds. But again, the irony here of one crown gained and one crown lost is something that I hope will weigh heavy on us. Now shift from David to Solomon. And when it comes to Solomon, and particularly the temple, that was the focus in 1 Kings. It's also the focus at the end of 1 Chronicles, beginning of 2 Chronicles. But there are two phrases that are used to describe the Temple of Solomon. Beauty of holiness is a great one we just saw, but these two refer specifically to Solomon's temple, and they're two of my favorite descriptors of any temple. In 1 Chronicles 22, verse 5, it's described as exceeding magnifical. Now, magnifical isn't even a word. And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 9, it's described as wonderful great. Now, wonderful great, that's not even good grammar. But what I love here is, well, if you're talking about the house of God, then regular old vocabulary and grammar just won't cut it. You have to come up with something better. So the next time you go to the temple and step into that beautifully holy place. I hope that those words from the chronicler will pop into your head. Just look around. Try not to let your jaw drop too far and just think to yourself, this place is exceeding magnifical and wonderful great. The temple is all of that. In 1 Chronicles 28, verse 8, this is when David is giving Solomon his final charge concerning the kingdom. David says to him, "Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the congregation of the Lord, and in the audience of our God, keep and seek for all the commandments of the Lord your God." I don't know if I've ever seen those two verbs used with the commandments. Keep the commandments is everywhere, but seek for all the commandments, I don't know if I've ever seen that. I mean, it reminds me of Nephi having to get the brass plates from Laban when he's told, or when he finally understands, this is one of the things that tips him over the edge to realize, I really do have to do this horrible thing and obey God on a difficult command. It's when he says, we have to keep the commandments, but we can't keep commandments we don't know. And since the commandments or the law is written on the brass plates, we have to obtain them so we know the commandments we should be seeking. I think, again, back to Nephi's story and Lehi's story, that the beauty, the timing of the Liahona, it only comes after they have mastered obedience to the commandments that were written on the brass plates, the ones that were given to them by God directly. They had proven their absolute obedience. They had kept all the commandments, and now they were ready to seek after commandments they didn't yet know, that the words would appear on the Liahona and show them the way that they should go. So I'm struck by that phrase in 1 Chronicles 28:8, that it's not enough to simply keep the commandments we have. We ought to be seeking for the commandments we don't yet know. Think of Word of Wisdom. It was established for the weakest of those that could call themselves saints. Now think about the Sabbath day. There's some basics, but where do you go from there? Elder Bednar has taught some powerful lessons, that if obedience is what brings us happiness, then greater obedience will bring us greater happiness, and to be crowned with commandments, not a few. That phrase from Doctrine and Covenants, 59? That's what we're looking for. And literally looking for. Please crown me with additional commandments. I'm seeking for them because they grant me greater access to levels of happiness, peace, and rest that I've never had before. So seek after them. Well, one last chapter in 1 Chronicles that we either want to hit briefly, and then we'll jump forward into this week's material. The last chapter of 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, is David, some of his final words, and he's given Solomon his final charge. He's reviewing the things that he had done to try to prepare Israel to build a temple when the time came. And so 3 verses, I think, that just teach something beautiful here. Verse 3, "Moreover, because I have set my affection to the house of my God, I have of mine own proper good, of gold and silver, which I have given to the house of my God, over and above all that I have prepared for the holy house." Over and above. Do we go above and beyond in our temple work and our temple worship? Is it a place, the other phrase I like even more, where we have set our affection? Is our heart fixed and founded on the house of God? And is our affection there? I just want to go. I want to be in God's house. And if it is, then we will end up going over and above the bare minimum that we sometimes think we're supposed to be doing. I'm not trying to establish a quota here. I'm not trying to run faster than we have strength. This isn't a matter of checking boxes and keeping tally marks of how often I've gone. No, it's about setting the affections of our hearts on that place that is so exceeding magnifical. Another verse in 1 Chronicles 29, verse 9, "Then the people rejoiced, for that they offered willingly, because with perfect heart they offered willingly to the Lord. And David the king also rejoiced with great joy." No wonder he's asking us to set our affection there, because if it is, then our offerings will be willing instead of forced. And when we go because we want to, instead of feeling like in some way we're supposed to, it changes everything because it's our attitude. It's a perfect heart. Can we take that same advice when it comes to tithing or fast offerings or service or whatever it is we do? Is our heart in the right place? Are we willing? Notice David is focused there not just on what was given, but how it was given. And that's actually the Lord's focus on the story of the widow's mite. We always talk, she gave all that she had. Oh, true. But look closer at the account, and it says that Jesus was watching to see how people put things into the treasury. Not just how much, but just plain how. What's your attitude? We'll see that story next year. Last one in 1 Chronicles 29, this one's verse 14. David says, "But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly after this sort?" It's like, can you believe? Maybe we're not the natural men and women we used to be. Well, no, if you're letting God change you. "For all things come of thee," David says, "and of thine own have we given thee." If we, that's what makes it easier to be willing in our offerings, willing in our sacrifice, because we know it's not ours to begin with. It's like when you're teaching little children the story about tithing and you give them 10 things and ask them to return only one. If you do it fast enough, hopefully it hasn't gone so slowly that they think those 10 objects belong to them. If it's quick exchange, then it's like, well, of course you can have one back. You can have all 10 back. They belong to you. The fact you'd let me even hold on to 9 for myself is incredibly generous. Well, that's the idea and the attitude there when it comes to building the temple. Everything comes from God. We're only giving back to Him what belongs to Him to begin with. I hope that makes consecration a little easier to come by, since it's not just our money that God has given us, but it's our time, it's our talents, it's our lives. And He can take them whenever He wants. So what's a better option? Give to Him all that we can. It belongs to Him to begin with. Now, I hope that whets your appetite. I didn't cover everything, but just going through 1st and 2nd Chronicles this week, in review of last week's lesson and preparing for this one, made me fall in love again with that beautiful account of Israelite history. Now, as we shift gears back to our story and pick up where we left off from last week, we're going to meet 2 kings to replace the 1 king that we ended with last week. By the time Solomon is done and his reign has ended, the kingdom's going to split in half, and it will take 2 kings to replace him. And those are Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Now, we're going to spend the bulk of our time with kings this week, next week, and the week after that, but also spend some healthy time with prophets. Elijah is our hero this week, and Elisha is our hero next week. And sadly, if you only study the 3 chapters in this week's Come Follow Me, you only get to hang out with Elijah, and you don't see the historical context of the kings that are surrounding him. Obviously, you'll meet Ahab, who is his foil in all of this, but you don't see how Ahab got himself into his mess. In some ways, we have spent all of our history thus far with prophets. We think of Adam and Enoch and Noah, there's prophets. We think of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, there's prophets. It kind of falls apart. Well, you get Moses and Joshua, there's prophets, but then it falls apart in the reigns of the judges. Pride cycle after pride cycle. And yes, there's a deliverer, but in some ways it seems to be more political deliverance, of course with a healthy helping of spirituality along the way. But it's not until you meet Samuel, and he comes as such a pleasant surprise. Yes, there's been Eli, a high priest, and there are priests at the tabernacle doing their thing, but in terms of a prophet receiving the word of God and crying repentance and working miracles and guiding people back to heaven, we've kind of lost sight of those in the book of Judges. And then when you get to Samuel, the focus is on Saul. And yes, Samuel's crying repentance to him. Then the focus shifts to David. And yeah, we got to meet Nathan, but we don't know much about him. And the same kind of thing with Solomon, focus on kings, but we have to understand there are prophets that run throughout this time period as well. Elijah and Elisha will be major characters. People like Nathan and Gad and Ahijah, all of whom we met last week, are more minor characters. But prophets are running through this history as well. From this point forward, we kind of have to watch these 2 strands interweave, the political and the religious, church and state, and to see when state is willing to follow church versus when state is trying to push away church. Oh, it spells good news or bad news for the kingdoms of Israel, depending on how they're doing. I think there's some application in our day that I hope we're sensing. But let's dive into this political history to see the spirituality running through it. So 1 Kings chapter 12. Like I said, we get to see Solomon's kingdom split in half. We only had 3 kings of united Israel, Saul, David, Solomon. And now we met Jeroboam at the very end of last week's material when one of those minor prophets comes on the scene and sees Jeroboam in his beautiful new cloak or tunic and rips it into 12 pieces and gives him 10 pieces back. Sorry about your clothing, but that was a heck of a visual aid. 10 of the tribes will belong to you. And this is the chapter where we see that prophecy fulfilled. The chapter starts with Solomon dying and Rehoboam, his son, taking his place. But news of Solomon's death spreads far and wide. He was that famous, he was that important. So the world knows, including people in Egypt. And that's where Jeroboam had gone to hide when he found out that Solomon was seeking his own life. Now that the enemy is gone, the danger has passed, Jeroboam comes back to Israel. But now there's a concern with how are things going to go with Solomon's successor. In verse 3, Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spake unto Rehoboam, saying, Thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father, and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we will serve thee. Now they're probably not complaining about the 7 years that they spent building the Lord's house. But the 13 years they spent building Solomon's, yeah, that probably chafed a bit. And for them to come and say, your father was a pretty tough, incredibly wise, don't get me wrong, and a great man of God for most of his reign. But he knew how to tax people. He knew how to turn the screws to get as much out of us as he possibly could. And we're hoping, in fact, now we're officially asking for a lighter burden from his successor. If you will lighten that load, lower taxes for crying out loud. Don't require so much effort in terms of public works projects. What's left? He enriched the kingdom. Then we will serve you diligently, faithfully, humbly throughout your reign as well. Now that was a good thing to ask. And we'll see Rehoboam's response in just a moment. But I think there's a bigger question here. And it's for Rehoboam. Namely, what kind of a leader will you be? Will you be the type that leads in strength or weakness? Or perceived strength or perceived weakness? And who's doing the perceiving? Interesting questions. Will you be the type that let's put it this way. Have you ever been a coach before? Coached one of your children's soccer teams or t-ball or whatever it might be? To watch coaches, even on the professional level, there are yellers and screamers, and then there are those who seem totally unperturbed by the mistakes that their players make. And what kind of a coach do you want to be? I think in some ways the better question is, what kind of coach do your players need? Because some players respond very well to get in your face and call you out and get the adrenaline pumping and get angry at me and then take it out on the other team. Then again, there are other players that would get crushed emotionally if one of their coaches yelled at them. Throughout my playing career, I had both kinds of coaches, and thankfully could respond to either one. But there are players out there that need a very particular kind, and that's true of parenting. It's true of leading in your wards and stakes or branches, and I pray that we can ask these kinds of questions whether or not the people that we lead come to us and ask for a change. If you think about the gifts of the Spirit and the differences of administration, that is a spiritual gift every leader ought to be coveting earnestly. What kind of differences should I make in my own administration? Or differences from the previous administration? Not that they did it wrong, but is there a different avenue that we should be pursuing, a different course that we should pursue? We may all have developed a certain leadership style or coaching style or parenting style. You might need to turn those singulars into plurals and have multiple leadership styles depending on which child you happen to be parenting at the moment. do what's best for them. In this case, you picture how Rehoboam would feel. I'm just beginning my reign, and all of a sudden people are calling into question how my dad did things. Are they wondering, are they calling me into question as well? I barely started. And so how's he going to react when someone questions his leadership? That's the real test. Will I double down and push back, or will I be humble and open enough to weigh the options and think things through? Well, notice how Rehoboam does it. Verse 6, King Rehoboam consulted with the old men, so far so good, that stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived, and said, how do ye advise that I may answer this people? You were part of the previous administration. Should we make a difference? Help me understand why things were done this way. That's an extremely helpful thing to do, especially if you're filling somebody else's shoes. Talk to their previous advisors. Talk to the people that they led. Talk to them if possible, and ask them the thinking, the philosophy behind the way they led or the decisions that they made. That might save you from some serious problems yourself, realizing, oh, that's what they were up against. That's why they did it this way. I was just going to go in and change it all. There was some wisdom in what they did. Thank you for saving me from that pitfall. Well, in this case, however, they spake unto him, and they said, if thou wilt be a servant unto this people this day, and wilt serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be thy servants forever. So interestingly, even those who had advised Solomon saw the wisdom in changing the approach. Actually, yes, in your case, I think it would be better to go a little softer than your father did. Maybe, in fact, they were counseling Solomon along those lines earlier and Solomon ignored them. We don't know. But that was the advice that they gave to Solomon's son. A servant leadership, go lead with humility and meekness. I mean, we saw that with David consulting, right? Trying to balance agency and inspiration in what he was doing 2 generations back. So let's try it again. Let's bring this back. Praise and positivity in our coaching. This is the Doctrine and Covenants 121 approach. And we'll just lead with gentleness and persuasion and love unfeigned. Sound good? Verse 8, but he, Rehoboam, forsook the counsel of the old men, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men that were grown up with him, and which stood before him. Now, is he just looking for a second opinion? If so, that's fine. But if he's automatically rejecting the earlier advice because those men are old, and I'd rather listen to my peers, young men that grew up with me, we know the dangers of racism and sexism, but ageism is one we don't talk about as much. And I wonder, is Rehoboam guilty of that from the start? Just automatically assuming they're a generation removed, and so they're out of touch. And yeah, maybe it worked in a previous administration, but not in mine. So just out with the old, in with the new, and I only want people like me. The danger of that is you end up creating echo chambers with people with your same perspective by and large, or your same level of experience by and large. And yeah, that could be amazing on the innovation side of things because you're open to those new ideas. But like I said before, if you haven't at least consulted with the prior, you may be walking into traps that they already learned to avoid. You may be reinventing wheels that they spent a lifetime perfecting. I actually read an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal a while back, that talked about these young companies and tech firms and software companies and so on. And it's the young that are driving those kinds of things, and for good reason. But the article pointed out, as far as leadership councils are concerned, you need to balance the innovation that comes from the young with the tradition that comes from the old. And to balance conservatism with progressivism, for example, in politics. To balance an openness to the new and an understanding from the old, it allows us to be both wise and open-minded. And that's an amazing combination. There's a contrary here that needs to be proven too. The old men could provide the ballast at the bottom of the ship, keep it from tipping over. And then the young men could fill the sails and get this ship moving forward with speed. Unfortunately, that's not what Rehoboam wanted. And he preferred his little echo chamber of like-minded yes men, and then therefore ignored the counsel of people that were older and, yes, wiser than he. In verse 10, he took the young men's advice. Thus shalt thou say unto them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's loins. And now, whereas my father did lade you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father hath chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. There's some powerful language there, and basically it's the equivalent of, I've got more strength in my little finger than my dad had in his entire body. Sometimes sounds like the young that just want to show up the old and launch out in new directions. For him to say it that way, though, you thought it was bad under my dad's reign? You're going to be dreaming you had it so easy again. Now, this doesn't sound like a good way to win friends and influence people, unless you assume, oh, they'll respond best to strength, to power. My dad was a powerful and strong person, and since that's what got them to follow him, then surely then more of the same will bring them to follow me even better. Be careful about that. Again, this is a time to prove contrary. It's a time to balance differences in administration. Because if you're doubling down on someone else's strength, let's even give Solomon the benefit of the doubt and assume that that was a strength, a good way to lead. If you're doubling down on somebody else's strength, when they had actually paid the price to prove the contrary and tried to balance that strength with an opposite one to keep the virtue from becoming a vice, if you weren't wise enough to see that balancing taking place, and then you take a virtue and you push it to the extreme, uncouple it from its contrary, then now your virtue has become a vice. And that's exactly what's happened with Rehoboam. To whatever degree Solomon's strength was a strength, it's now become nothing but weakness in the reign of Rehoboam. Regardless, he follows the young men's advice. He announces his intentions to the people. Now, can you picture how this is going to go over? Verse 16. So when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, there's no buy-in. There's no democracy within this monarchy. The people answered the king, saying, what portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. That's Rehoboam's great-grandfather. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, David. So Israel departed unto their tents. It's a great line. It's been used elsewhere in history. To your tents, O Israel. A way of saying, forget what's been given. It's now every man for himself. And you see that in the second line too. You see to thine own house, you rulers from the Davidic monarchy. We'll have nothing to do with you. You've only cared about yourself. Well, we're going to follow your example and only care about ourselves too. And so they go home, leave him. In verse 17 then, but as for the children of Israel which dwelt in the cities of Judah, Rehoboam reigned over them. Unfortunately for Rehoboam, that's not the entire house of Israel. The united kingdom that survived the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon have now come crashing down, splitting apart, so that you have a northern kingdom that's going to be called Israel. Sometimes it's called Ephraim as kind of a leading tribe there. And then the southern kingdom that will be called the kingdom of Judah from this point forward. You will have Rehoboam in the south, Judah. You will have Jeroboam in the north, Israel. And like I said, from this point forward, they will be separate kingdoms. I actually am grateful that their names sound so alike. Mnemonic device, it helps me remember. So Saul, David, Solomon, then split the kingdom to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, with Rehoboam in the south and Jeroboam in the north. And just as prophesied, if Jeroboam kept his 10 pieces of ripped up coat, he will receive 10 tribes from the north. Judah will not be entirely alone. Some of Benjamin will be there with him. That's usually how the two tribes are described in the south. Although Simeon was within the borders of Judah, and so that might be part two. It's a little bit tricky, and we'll see some of some porous borders as we move forward. But over this one issue, what kind of leader will you be? Double down and show how strong you are, and I won't be bullied, and I'm not going to take the people's advice? Or be gentle and be easy to be entreated, and at least entertain the possibility that someone else has a good idea, and hear the grievances or the thoughts and perspectives of those that you're responsible for, and be willing to adjust as necessary. Thomas Paine, the great writer of Common Sense, actually made fun of King George III of England, and he used this story as one of his punchlines. where he said, it took a wicked king in ancient Israel who would not understand where his people were coming from to alienate his people so much that they rebelled against him. And they said, now Rehoboam only lost 10 tribes. You, George, you've lost 13. Well, again, what kind of leaders will we be? Well, in verse 18 and 19, what's Rehoboam going to do now? You just lost the vast majority of your subjects. You going to double down again or let things go? In verse 18, then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was over the tribute. So here's the tax collector. And all Israel stoned him with stones that he died. Therefore King Rehoboam made speed to get him up to his chariots to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. There was the straw that broke the camel's back. We just told you we don't want anything to do with it. First, kindly, gently, we asked for some mercy from the throne. Not only did we not get the mercy, we got extra justice to the point of injustice thrown back in our face. And so we decided to leave. But you wouldn't leave us alone. And who did you send to coax us back into commitment? Your tax collector? After just warning us that you were going to increase those things? Here comes the scorpion in chief, ready to sting us until we give the king back more than his father even asked. Oh, read the room, will you? This is not going to go over well. So again, you see some negative leadership on the part of Rehoboam. The rebelling tribes then make Jeroboam their king. And still, Rehoboam won't give up. In verse 21, when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men which were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Oh, I'm sure this is going to go really well. Your first attempt ended in shambles. Your second attempt was horrible. It ended up costing your servant his life. And now third, you're going to go send an army to forcibly return them? We just talked about the American Revolutionary War. How about the American Civil War? It's amazing what Abraham Lincoln was trying to do. To use an army to keep people from seceding from the Union, but governing in such a way that hopefully Reconstruction would go smoothly. Sadly, he didn't live to be able to do it, and I don't think anyone could have done it well except him. Andrew Johnson didn't do it well at all. But to see what Rehoboam was trying to do, he wasn't going to do it well either. Rehoboam was more of an Andrew Johnson than an Abraham Lincoln any day. Okay, we got problems here. This is actually one of those places that 2 Chronicles gives us an insight as to why it was this way. 2 Chronicles 12 verse 14 speaks of Rehoboam and says that he did evil, and here's why. Because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. He came into his leadership position totally unprepared to do it. His heart wasn't in the right place. Remember, that was the word that was used so often with King David. I need a leader who has a heart like mine. Rehoboam never got his heart to a point where it was founded on God and on goodness. Now, in the midst of all of this, as Rehoboam is mustering his army to go force his disloyal subjects to become loyal citizens again, a man of God named Shemaiah comes to Rehoboam. Now, again, this is a prophet who intersects with the king, but we don't really know anything about him, and this is all we get from him. He comes on the scene and says to Rehoboam in verse 24, "Thus saith the Lord," I'm speaking for him, "Ye shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing is from me." And thankfully, they hearkened therefore to the word of the Lord and returned to depart, according to the word of the Lord. Amazing that Rehoboam finally figured it out. At least this much. It took a very clear directive from a servant of God, divine intervention. Thus saith the Lord, don't do this. Forget the old counselors and the young counselors. How about some counsel from God himself? Don't go to battle in this way. It will only cause further problems. And thankfully, Rehoboam responded well. First time. Meanwhile, what's happening up north? Jeroboam settles into his new reign. He sets up a new capital in Shechem, which will become Samaria. And then in verse 26 and 7, Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah. And they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Now we're back to the question we were asking Rehoboam before. As he's beginning his reign, how will you rule? How are you going to get people to follow you? That's a tough question for leaders. And now Jeroboam's wondering the same thing. How am I going to lead? We saw a negative example from Rehoboam. Sadly, we're now about to see a negative example from Jeroboam, although for a different reason. For Rehoboam, I don't want my people to think I'm weak. If I just give in to their demands, is that just appeasement? And then they'll ask for more and more and more, and pretty soon they're ruling me instead of vice versa? No, I've got to show that I'm strong. Jeroboam actually is the exact opposite problem. I don't want to come across as too strong and too demanding. I'm going to learn from Rehoboam's mistake, but I'm just afraid that people are going to go back to Jerusalem despite my best efforts and even despite Rehoboam's worst efforts. Now, why would that be the case? That's what he's saying. They're going to return to the house of David, and my reign will be a very short-lived one. And he hints at the reason why. They'll go to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord. You see, Rehoboam was worried that worship in Jerusalem would get in the way of his rule in Samaria. That their church is going to get in the way of my state, and so I'm going to have to do something about the church to keep them loyal to the state. And that's often what ends up happening throughout history. That political rulers will push for things, but try to use religion as leverage to motivate the people to follow what the political arm is trying to flex and trying to do. In this case, the worry is the temple. Rehoboam has one. I don't. And since that is the chief place of Israelite worship, that's the place where the festivals are supposed to take place throughout the year, and all Jews are supposed to return to the place that God has set his name. Spiritual tourism is one thing, but if this leads to a lack of loyalty to my throne, then we've got a problem here, and what am I going to do about it? Notice in 28 and 9, here's his answer. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. Wait. They're making golden calves? Have you not read the book of Exodus? Well, maybe not. He said unto his people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. So behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. Now, we always talk about Dan to Beersheba, and Dan was the northern edge, and Beersheba was the southern edge, but that's of united Israel. The part that Jeroboam is reigning over, it's Dan to the north and Bethel to the south. And Bethel, great place because it has some great spiritual connotation. Where Jacob's ladder was, the name itself means house of God. What more could you ask? If there were ever a great site for a pseudo-sanctuary, then this is the one. We could set up our little counterfeit temple right here. And so that's what he does. We mentioned this briefly when we talked golden calf, that this didn't have to be some kind of pagan image. Well, if God, Elohim, is represented sometimes as a bull, if Christ is the Lamb of God, why don't we go with this as far as Jehovah or Elohim are concerned? And so yes, this is just an outward representation of the invisible reality of God, and we'll set one up, north side, south side, whichever one's most convenient for you, go ahead and worship there. And convenience is the operative term. That's what Jeroboam was after. His biggest concern was they'll go back to Jerusalem. But if I can give them something easier, something closer, something far more convenient, then can we do temple with a drive-through? Can we text our ministering messages? Is there anything else we can do to just make discipleship as undemanding as possible? Did you catch his phrase? It is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. So stay local. And don't go to the mountain, we'll bring the mountain to you. and all will be easier. Now this to me is one of the most important lessons we can learn from 1 Kings chapter 12. On the one hand, you saw Rehoboam making things too hard. But like I said, here you see Jeroboam making things too easy. There's a Goldilocks zone somewhere in between them, okay? A proving of contraries between the two. We don't have to make things hard just for hardness' sake, but to change things that really matter for the sake of convenience. I'll put it this way, to make sacrifices non-sacrificial, is it still a sacrifice then? I would just caution all of us, whether in our leadership or in our followership, beware of making everything easy just for the sake of ease, especially if it's motivated by fear that anything harder will scare people away. It's been done sociologically in terms of religions in America, at least, that it's the high demand religions that tend to make a difference in their members' lives in ways that low demand religions just don't. That low demand religions tend to lose their members more than high demand. Somebody, I think it was Larry King, in fact, that asked, or maybe it was 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace, that asked President Hinckley, why is your church growing so fast? And President Hinckley's unironic answer, at least it wasn't ironic to him, but it probably was to the viewers. He said, because we ask hard things of them. The Lord demands sacrifice. And again, the irony there, that doesn't make any sense. Wouldn't that scare people away? No. People want to be asked to rise to the occasion. They want to be lifted above themselves. And so again, it's not hardness or harshness for its own sake. But some things worth becoming just don't come easily. Can you imagine a gym that advertised itself as easy lifting and will come and will spot everything? Or how about a no gravity gym? Oh, come and you can lift as much weight as you want and we've made it easier on you. It's too much for you to actually lift weights that weigh something. No, as has been said, Jesus Christ is an inconvenient Messiah. And part of that inconvenience is to help us overcome the natural man that typically tends to look for the easy way out. I love this principle. The Lord is not asking too much of us. And for any of you that are on the side of the spectrum that you're already running faster than you have strength, it's not the Lord that's asking you to do all that. It's not the Lord that's making it too much. He knows just how to stay within the Goldilocks zone between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. He is the true king of all Israel, and we can trust him in that. You see two verses, by the way, in the 2 Chronicles version of this that add some detail. 2 Chronicles 11, verse 13. This is when Jeroboam sets up idolatry in Israel. Golden calf to the north, golden calf to the south. And ironically, how did the people react to his easier path? They actually leave him to go seek the harder path. His attempt to avoid this actually prompted the very thing he was trying to avoid. It's so ironic. It says that the priests and the Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him, Rehoboam, down south, out of all their coasts. For the Levites left their suburbs and their possession and came to Judah and Jerusalem, where the real temple was. For Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord. You see, if we don't really need a real place to serve God, do we really need real priests to help us do it? And so he's alienating people who know right from wrong, who know that the real place versus these counterfeit other options, who know the harder way and don't get duped into taking the easy way out. Same chapter, 2 Chronicles 11. Notice in verse 16, after them, out of all the tribes of Israel, such as set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice unto the Lord God of their fathers. Again, in your efforts to make things easy, you scared people away. Back in the direction of doing hard things like they knew they should be. It's amazing how Rehoboam's plan backfired on him and Jeroboam's plan backfired on him. Both of them missed the Goldilocks zone. by taking a virtue and then taking it to that extreme where it becomes a vice. And I love in the midst of all of this, what is the homing beacon that people just can't get cut away from? What's the magnet to their souls that bring them to do hard things? The temple. The temple is the ultimate magnet. And it's what allows, it's what enables people and motivates people to do some of the hardest things imaginable, of saving for a lifetime or selling all that you have just to be able to go to the house of the Lord. And that difficulty, when they realize, give it willingly, the heart is there, my heart is perfect, all those beautiful lines, they set their affections upon the house of the Lord. It's exceeding magnifical, it's wonderful, great, it will be worth any sacrifice. It doesn't matter how far I have to travel to get to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the place where God has set his name. And it's the place I want to take that name upon me. And it's amazing to see people throughout the history of the church make incredible sacrifices to come to the house of the Lord. This chapter teaches that principle powerfully. By the way, this is also where you might be able to solve a potential problem with the Book of Mormon that some detractors have tried to point out. They bring up the fact that Lehi lived in Jerusalem. Okay, the Book of Mormon says as much, but also admits that Lehi was from the tribe of Manasseh. And people that attack the Book of Mormon like to say, oh, see, Joseph Smith didn't know his geography well enough. He put a Manassehite in Jerusalem. Pfft, doesn't he know that the inheritance of the tribe of Manasseh was further north? Oh, actually, they're probably right. I bet Joseph Smith didn't know that. But what they don't know is verses like this, that those who were faithful, those that weren't duped by the path of least resistance that Jeroboam was offering them, they took the path of greater resistance, left Israel, and came and gathered to Jerusalem themselves from all these other tribes. That's what the chronicler said, out of all the tribes of Israel, including Manasseh. Jerusalem is going to become an increasingly diverse melting pot. And what they're all melting into is the fire of faith burning from the temple of Solomon. This actually speaks really highly of Lehi's ancestry. Well, whoever his grandpa, great-grandpa, whoever it was that decided the temple's worth it. We're going to pick up and leave the land of our inheritance and go to a more specific land of promise where the temple is. No wonder Lehi found himself able to do that all over again in his own day. So powerful. Meanwhile, what's going on with the Israelites up that don't take the hard path, that stick with the easy one? Notice back in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 30, this thing became a sin, this thing of setting up rival places of worship. For the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. They took the northern one. Others would have taken the southern one in Bethel. And he, Jeroboam, made an house of high places and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. And no wonder the Levites are leaving Israel to go down to Judah, where their services are needed, where their authority is actually honored and required. Here again, you see Jeroboam choosing the path of least resistance. We're going to make high places. Don't make them go all the way up to Jerusalem. Just, this place is high enough, good enough for now. And then we'll take the lowest of the people. I love that juxtaposition. A fake high place, but a real low person, because they'll fall for it. They'll settle into this counterfeit lifestyle. You want to be our priest? Sure. Didn't we see that in the book of Judges where it's, hey, we need a priest. I mean, I made my own little images and I've got my own little ephod. I could use a priest. Son, you want to do it? I'm not a Levite. That's okay. Oh, until a Levite comes and is willing to be hired out for priestcraft. We saw these problems earlier. And now Jeroboam, is making this mistake on a much larger scale. Okay, big problems up north. So once again, we see this overswinging of the pendulum from the overzealousness of Rehoboam in the south to the laxity, the underzealousness of Jeroboam in the north. One more detail from 2 Chronicles, that version, chapter 13, verse 9. Have ye not cast out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron and the Levites, and have made you priests after the manner of the nations of other lands? So that whosoever cometh to consecrate himself with a young bullock and 7 rams, the same may be a priest of them that are no gods. Talk about in your face. Jeroboam just got called out in that verse. You really think that's all it takes? Talk about priest craft. Anybody who's willing to learn the craft will take it. Anybody who can, if you just bring a bullock and 7 rams, good enough. That'll be, I don't know, this is your test run to try out some sacrifice. And if it looks good, then sure, you can be a priest, even though you're not one. It's fitting because you're worshiping a God that isn't really one. The whole thing is counterfeit top to bottom. Speaking of which, go back to the 1 Kings version, and in chapter 12, verse 32, Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. So now he's creating some counterfeit holy days. And he offered upon the altar, fake altar here, so did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made, self-made gods. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places, which he had made, man-made high places. Verse 33, so he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel, the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month, which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. I love the way that that's all phrased, because the repetition of, oh, he made that. Oh, he made that. Oh, he just devised it out of his own heart. Down south, where did Judah receive their ways of worship from God? A temple that God commanded and in a way designed himself, based on a tabernacle that he commanded and designed himself. And what's happening up north in Israel? Can we just make our own way? It'll be easier. And so counterfeit everything all the way down. Do you remember what Jesus warned Joseph Smith about in the Sacred Grove? That people draw near me with their lips, but their hearts, that all-important body part, is far from me. They have the forms of godliness. It's a pretty good counterfeit, but they deny the power thereof. They've lowered standards so that anybody can clear that bar, just in hopes that if we make it easy enough, we're not going to scare anyone away. Actually, you're not going to inspire anyone to come. And you don't have the power to bring them anyway. I worry sometimes that that's the path that people are taking in our day. That they are looking for religious trappings. I've seen other articles that even in the workplace, we need ritual. And in life, people still need ritual and rites of passage and so on. So do we just come up with our own? Is it graduation, wearing the robes of the apostate priesthood instead of temple robes? Is it just the things that we do, rites of passage that aren't really a passage worth taking? I don't know. We've transferred our loyalties and our allegiance. We've switched our worship to sporting events and concerts and entertainment, and the stars we follow are no longer prophets and apostles, but they're celebrities and athletes and entertainers, and I just think we're losing something. What we're seeing here through the example of Jeroboam is what man-made religion looks like, and its lack of power to hold the human heart. I'll give you one last thing about this, and then we do need to move forward. My favorite sociologist of religion is a guy named Peter Berger, not a member of the church. I believe he's Lutheran. But he wrote a book on the sociological aspect of religion. What does religion do for people? To borrow Clayton Christensen's idea of we hire things to perform jobs in our life, Berger's whole idea is, what are the jobs sociologically in terms of community, society, that religion is being hired to perform? The book was called The Sacred Canopy, and the title itself just kind of suggests what he was describing, that religion is meant to be our sacred canopy that keeps us in from the rain. It keeps us out of the elements of a world that we just can't come to grips with existentially. And so religion helps us put ourselves on the map of meaning and where we happen to be and why I'm here and what's the purpose of life and so on. Those are awesome. That's one of the reasons I like the book. But here's the part that's tricky. At the beginning of the book, he admits, I am a sociologist. That is a social science. And as a scientist, even on the soft sciences, I'm supposed to stick with scientific instruments. So brace yourself. I'm going to try to study religion from what he called methodological atheism. In other words, I'm going to bracket out God and spirit and the divine and the supernatural and the miraculous and pull that out so I can just look at religion as if it were a man-made phenomenon and figure out what jobs it's being hired to perform. Well, and here's the jobs. In some ways, it's kind of the Marxist opiate of the masses. It just helps sad people feel better. People that live in a world of chaos, it gives them some pseudo sense of control. Well, he got so much pushback from believers, from religious people, saying, how dare you explain away religion in your efforts to explain it? You've explained away the most important part. The absolute essential element is God. And so to try to explain religion as an atheist, how dare you? You don't even know what you're talking about. Well, the irony was, Berger did know what he was talking about, not just as a sociologist, but as a man of faith. And so he had to write a sequel to the book, to basically push back to people and say, I'm not an atheist. I was just trying to be a disciplined social scientist and figure out from a purely sociological standpoint, what does religion do? In some ways, he was Jeroboam's chief advisor. You're going to need some places of worship. You're going to need some feast days and festivals. You're going to need some priests, quote unquote, some places to worship, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because it'll do something for your people. Well, in the second book, Berger basically says, look, people, to be true to my discipline, I approached religion from a position of methodological atheism. But to be true to my heart, my soul, my spirit, my religious experience, may I boldly proclaim that religion is no mere man-made sacred canopy. It is a canopy created by the Creator himself, placed in the heart of his children. There has never been a society that didn't start with some kind of desire for transcendence and something above them. There has never yet been a society that was purely secular. It's only in our day that people are trying to create those, and yet the control group, the period to be able to have a control group has passed. I always worry that, is there some sinking suspicion they have of, but wait a minute, society, even secular society, was religious in its roots. So it's too late for us to run a controlled experiment. Am I afraid that even our so-called scientific-based or secular altruism does have some deep religious roots? Oh, I don't want to admit that. Anyway, I'm sorry if I'm going too far afield on this, but the religious geek in me is coming out because I see it here in 1 Kings chapter 12. Real religion in the south and pseudo-spirituality in the north. And Jeroboam trying to make things easy, but keep the trappings of religion because I guess it's supposed to do something, and people need to have those needs met. They knew better. They knew that those needs weren't being truly met in the deepest ways because it was only form without the power thereof. I'm grateful for real power that comes from real priesthood and real places of real worship. I'm grateful to live in Judah, in Jerusalem. And I'm grateful for ancestors that came out of Israel to find real Israel. I know there has to be something more out there. And they came. That's what is causing Jeroboam to lose citizens to Rehoboam, just like he feared. His plan backfired in fascinating ways. Oh, enough with chapter 12. Can we move forward to chapter 13? Here is a test of obedience that we're going to have to grapple with. Jeroboam is burning incense at his, or quote-unquote incense, at his quote-unquote altar in the quote-unquote holy place of Bethel. An unnamed man of God comes to see him. Now, this is again, prophets intersecting with politics. We don't know his name. We don't know anything about him, but he's a man of God. And he comes and since Jeroboam seems to be past feeling and won't listen to him, maybe I can just talk to the altar instead. And if I address it to him and let Jeroboam just overhear, then maybe it won't hurt his heart so much. He cries against the altar. This is verse 2. In the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. Now that's a brutal prophecy. I'm sorry, altar. Someday, instead of lifting sacrifice to God, you'll be lifting sacrificers. But right now it's false sacrifice, and then it will be false sacrificers. This is a prophecy of the religious reforms that will take place under the reign of King Josiah. We'll meet him in 2 weeks. Okay, hold out for that one. In other words, Jeroboam, your idolatry isn't going to last. And neither is your kingdom. So tragic that you might be holding on to those 10 pieces of material. I think the scraps of cloth will last longer than your actual reign will. Because you weren't faithful. You didn't trust the God who gave you the kingdom. You thought you had to make things easier instead. So verse 3, this man of God gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign which the Lord hath spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent. It'll break in half. And the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. Now that's a pretty good preview of coming attractions. If he's prophesying an eventual end of idolatry, well, these false altars will be broken down. And yes, Josiah will do it. But to show that it's going to happen, I'll give you the preview of coming attractions with a breaking of the altar right here. And sure enough, that's what happens. Jeroboam is livid. I guess he was eavesdropping over in the conversation with the altar after all. And so he reaches out his hand, either to grab this unnamed prophet himself or to point at him and send the troops to go get him. But as soon as he reaches out his hand withers. It says it dries up. And he couldn't use it. He could not pull it in again to him. And immediately thereafter, the altar also was rent, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. All of this is a perfect visual aid. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. You're reaching out to try to stop me, and God stops you in the act. Your altar of sacrifice, where no real sacrifice is taking place, that altar will break under the weight of its own falsity, its own priestcraft. And like I said, that's exactly what will happen on a much larger scale once King Josiah takes the reins. Jeroboam, then frustrated as ever, asks the man of God, a little more sheepishly, humbly now, will you heal my hand? You obviously have power, or at least God does, and I'm really sorry I was trying to stop you. Will you heal me? And he even says, I'll give you a great reward if you'll do so. The man of God responds, verse 8, if thou wilt give me half thine house, I will not go in with thee. Neither will I eat bread nor drink water in this place. And here's why. For so was it charged me by the word of the Lord, saying, eat no bread, nor drink water, nor turn again by the same way that thou camest. So no, I can't go home with you. But I guess I could heal your hand from here, and sure enough, he does. So Jeroboam's probably fine, like, oh, I got what I wanted anyway. I didn't want to have to be hospitable and feed you anyway. So thanks for the hand, and you can leave now. Now, what's interesting in all of this is the way this man of God says it. God has charged me. I'm here fasting, okay? This is real worship as I go to cry repentance against false worship. And God has commanded me not to take anybody's hospitality. You certainly haven't been hospitable to God, so I'm not going to be his mortal mouthpiece or his earthly avatar. I'm going to go back to my area and just leave things since you've left God. In a way, it reminds me of Balaam before we meet his donkey, where Balak sends the messengers and says, come and I will reward you if you will simply serve me. And Balaam says, can't do it unless God allows it. And here God isn't allowing it. So you have this man of God following the Lord's commands. We've got exact obedience, but this obedience is about to get tested. Jeroboam's was, now we're going to see this man's. So what happens next? It's strange. Brace yourself. He's returning home, And another man of God comes out to meet him. He's referred to as an old prophet. He meets him on the way and invites him to his home to eat, just like Jeroboam had. Now, the man had resisted Jeroboam's invitation, and immediately he resists this old prophet's invitation as well. And he tells him everything that he just said. I'm on the Lord's errand. I have to do things the Lord's way. He's told me to stay fasting and don't take anybody's hospitality and just go back home. And so that's what I'm doing. Well, you could have left it at that, but this old prophet doesn't. Instead, he responds in verse 18, "Oh, well, I am a prophet also as thou art. And an angel spake unto me by the word of the Lord, saying, Bring him back with thee into thine house, that he may eat bread and drink water. But he lied unto him." Now, I warned you, this is a strange story. It sounds like a strange prophet. In fact, is he a prophet? I don't know. That's the word that's used here, an old prophet. But an old prophet of whom? Maybe we ask. Or is he was an old prophet? Is he still a current one? Because, on the one hand, this could just be a test of obedience. And yes, he was a true prophet with a true inspiration, and God is saying, okay, he resisted the temptation when it came from a foe, Jeroboam. Will he resist the temptation when it comes from a friend? We've got to prove him on this. There's a great lesson there, right? To think about, or put it this way, to think that you have overcome a big temptation, and so now you're excused from similar strength the rest of the day. I said no then, so I'm okay to say yes now, right? And again, it's from a friend, not a foe. That's all possible. Then again, this could be a false prophet. This could be a former prophet. And that's what makes this all the more insidious. It seems like it's coming from the right side of things. And after all, he's got all the right credentials. He said he's a prophet, just like me. He said an angel came, though I don't have any evidence. He said that the word of the Lord came to him. Now, at the end of the verse, but he lied unto him. That's show notes. That's what we know. But this poor man of God doesn't know that. And so I do wonder, is the Lord asking us or teaching us to get our own independent witness of what other people are saying, good or bad? Are we coming to learn for ourselves and gaining testimonies of our own? Because what ends up happening here is the young man falls for it, hook, line, and sinker. Oh, you got all the credentials I need, and so of course I'll come home with you. But then in verse 20, it came to pass as they sat at the table that the word of the Lord came unto the prophet that brought him back. So this time, is he now speaking as inspired? I don't know. He cried unto the man of God that came from Judah, saying, Thus saith the Lord, For as much as thou hast disobeyed the mouth of the Lord, and hast not kept the commandment which the Lord thy God commanded thee, thy carcass shall not come unto the sepulchre of thy fathers. Yikes. And sure enough, on the way home, the man is attacked by a lion and killed. Now, the story then kind of shifts gears to other things, back to Jeroboam, and we're kind of left in our confusion of what was that all for? No wonder we skip this chapter and come follow me. Wink, wink. Like I said before, is this a lesson on resisting temptation the whole way through? Not just thinking that resisting once means the test is over and now I can be off my guard. No, we need to be on guard at all times to watch and pray lest ye be led into temptation. To pray always to overcome the adversary. Is he trying to teach the lesson that, again, temptation is more dangerous when it comes from a seeming friend rather than an obvious enemy? And so, do I need to be extra careful when someone who seems to be on my side is telling me something easy, or trying to justify or even encourage disobedience? Or is he trying to teach me a lesson, like I said before, that I need to find out for myself and not just take everybody else's word for it? And that would be true of true prophets and not just false ones. Come to know for yourself. And perhaps this man's biggest mistake was not checking, allowing someone else's words to trump your own revelation. He knew his original marching orders came from God. That was individual and direct. The second one was secondary. and he didn't truly check the man's credentials. Heavenly Father, is this from thee? And he didn't recheck his own. I'm not saying we shouldn't be open to other views, right? Receiving counsel from other people, and especially ones that seem to be on our side. Hear them out. But like David had done earlier, yes, let's exercise some agency, but let's seek confirming inspiration. And this man hadn't done that. It was like Joshua with the Gibeonites, who got duped and didn't ask God for confirmation or clarification. Just thought he understood and was like, oh yeah, that seems right to me, and we'll go for it. And that was a mistake. This was a fatal mistake on this prophet's part. And that's tragic. It could be spiritually fatal on ours too. Come to know for yourself with direct revelation. We've got to be worthy of that. The chapter then comes to a close in 33 and 4. After this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way. So he's still not figuring it out, hasn't learned from his mistakes, like Rehoboam's problems earlier. But he made again of the lowest of the people priests of the high places. Whosoever would, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And the thing became sin unto the house of Jeroboam, even to cut it off and to destroy it from off the face of the earth. This is lowest common denominator priestcraft, as he'd been guilty of from the start. Unrepentant, goes right back on his old wicked ways. And just the way that's described. Oh, you want to be a priest? Sure. And the fact that it's something we can just give like that means that you don't really have anything to give after all. Whereas true priesthood is not for our giving or taking. It comes from God because it is his power. Well, there's chapter 13 for you. Now, chapter 14, still more wickedness, but this time in both north and south. At this time, Jeroboam's son falls sick. Jeroboam knows he's going to need the Lord's help to do this, to heal the boy, because nothing else is going to work. But he also knows, I'm not on God's best side right now, and so what do I do? He turns to his wife and he says, hey, you remember the prophet Ahijah? He's the one that tore my coat and gave me 10 pieces. Now, he is going to recognize my face, and he'll probably take the 10 pieces back. I don't want that to happen, and so tell you what, honey, we need his help, but I can't be the one to ask for it because I'm not worthy to receive it. So will you go, in fact, better yet, go in disguise. Hopefully he doesn't know you, and even if he did, you just be disguised. Don't mention my name at all. Just say you have a son. That way it's kind of honest. And you have a son that is suffering and sick, and you're asking the prophet for divine intervention. And will he please heal the boy? Oh, and from a distance. I mean, no need to do something hard and come all this way. Let's do a convenient miracle here. Stay where you are. Just say the word and heal my boy that has no connections to Jeroboam in any way, shape, or form. Does this sound good, honey? And she's like, sounds great. And so they go. I find this whole thing hilarious, by the way, because they trust the prophet's power and rely on it, but they don't trust the prophet's discernment. And so they try to get around it. Like, oh yeah, we'll be able to trick him into thinking we deserve his power, since we know he has his power. Do you not sense the illogic of this, Jeroboam? Anyway, verse 4 and 5 has this for more illogic. Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were set by reason of his age. With that, Jeroboam was probably thinking, sweet, you don't even need to worry about the disguise. But just in case, right? It's going to be easier to pull the wool over Ahijah's eyes since they don't even work anymore. This is great. And the Lord said unto Ahijah, somebody else who does have eyes to see, behold, the wife of Jeroboam cometh to ask a thing of thee for her son, for he is sick. Thus and thus shalt thou say unto her, for it shall be when she cometh in that she shall feign herself to be another woman. It's hilarious that the Lord is seeing through this deception and reveals it to this blind prophet who can now see better than anybody realizes. This actually reminds me of David B. Haight near the end of his life. He was up there. He's part of the group of President Nelson and President Hinckley in terms of apostles and prophets who lived to be, late 90s. But near the end of his life, Elder Haight couldn't see very well either. His eyes were set by reason of his age as well. But what I loved about Elder Haight, at one point in conference he said, the worse my eyesight becomes, the better my vision. And that's exactly what's happening here with Ahijah the prophet. He sees things crystal clear because it's God's eyes that he's relying upon, not his own mortal ones that, yes, might be deceived by a disguise, but not the divine. So when she comes in, what will he see? Just like was said at the end, he'll see someone feigning to be another woman, faking it, pretending to be someone that she isn't. And ironically, isn't that what we all do when we are guilty of hypocrisy? That I hope they see me as someone worthy of divine help, instead of what I really am, which isn't worthy to ask for it at all. I think too often we approach God or his servants in disguise, the disguise of a valiant or righteous disciple of Christ, when that needs to be our true identity all the way down. I mean, the whole thing, top to bottom, is ironic. We want you to see the future of our son, you blind seer. But we don't want you to see who we really are and that we aren't worthy to come and ask for it. We want you to, this is, talk about selective faith in God or in prophets, believing enough that they can do something. I'll put it this way. A lot of times when people are up in arms and protesting and wanting the prophets to do things their way, well, on the one hand, well, why even just start your own church, whatever. I mean, Jeroboam's doing it. Why don't you? Oh, no, I don't have that kind of authority. What, but the prophets do? So you're somehow banking on a prophet's authority to change things, but you want their authority to bow to yours? Is this making sense at all? I want them to use their influence. I trust that kind of power. But I want them to cave to my influence to do things my way. Yeah, that's selective faith. And we sometimes have that even in God. Yes, on your mercy. No, on your justice. Yes, on helping me. No, on calling me to repentance. Oh, we're all guilty of these kinds of illogical things. In verse 6, it was so, when Ahijah heard the sound of her feet, as she came in at the door, she hasn't even said anything yet, probably going to disguise her voice anyway, that he said, "Oh, come in, thou wife of Jeroboam. Why feignest thou thyself to be another? For I am sent to thee with heavy tidings." I love this drama as it begins to unfold. Oh, I see who you are and who you're trying to be, even before you present yourself before my blind eyes. God knows the whole story. True identity, false identity, what you're hoping for, what you want, and what he's going to do. And unfortunately, that is mostly bad news. Well, I have bad news and good news. Let me give them both to you. He tells her to go back and say to her husband, verse 7, "For as much as I exalted thee from among the people, and made thee prince over my people Israel, I brought you up to this throne, and rent the kingdom away from the house of David, and gave it thee. Yet thou hast not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments, and who followed me with all his heart, to do that only which was right in my eyes." In other words, I didn't take the kingdom away from David to give it to someone worse. My hope was to give it to someone better, but you're not being that person. You're trying to look like that person with all your priest craft and religious trappings. But that's man-made religion. And you weren't a man-made king. You were called by me to be something better, something higher, something holier. Please be that person. In verse 9, "But hast done evil above all that were before thee. For thou hast gone and made thee other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and hast cast me behind thy back." Strong language. To provoke me? To throw me away? And the way that he puts it, you didn't just abandon God, you replaced him with false gods of your own. You didn't just turn yourself away from me, you turned other people away from me as well. And that's what I have against you. So what will the result be for your son? Your heir, the heir to the throne of Israel, since that's what you're worried about? Well, here's the bad news. All of your male heirs will be cut off. If you actually read the verse where it's described, Ahijah uses some really strong graphic language. I won't read it in case there's kids listening in. I doubt that was a direct quote from God, but maybe Ahijah is an earthier prophet. But he's basically describing every male heir of your household will be cut off. I mean, you cast me behind your back, then it's only fitting. He then says in verse 10 that God will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam, as a man taketh away dung, till it be all gone. Now that's, again, some earthy language there, but describing the scattering of Israel like shoveling manure and just flinging it away, get the stench out of my nostrils. I mean, the sweet savor that's supposed to be coming up from incense altars, that's not what's happening up north, because it's false incense and false altars. So there, in the northern kingdom, these 10 tribes will end up lost tribes. Oh, and about your specific son. I've been talking about all of them. The one that you're worried about because he's sick, here's some more bad news and good news. Bad news, verse 12. Once you go home, when thy feet enter into the city, the child shall die. But here's the good news, if you can consider it that. He will at least have a proper burial. Isn't that nice? Well, isn't that what we always do for the dead? When you have the chance. You just won't have the chance. So here's the rest of the bad news. Verse 13. All Israel shall mourn for him and bury him. That's good news, actually. But the rest of the bad. For he only of Jeroboam shall come to the grave. He's the only heir that will have a proper burial. Because in him there is found some good thing toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam. I can't say the same for Jeroboam himself or for any of his other heirs. And so, of course, these 10 pieces of cloth will have to fray at the edges and be destroyed before they can be passed on to someone within the family. That cloak won't fit because Jeroboam is sewing his own spirituality from whole cloth, and it's not authorized by God. So that's the end of his kingdom after one generation. And the rest won't even be buried properly. In verse 14, moreover, the Lord shall raise him up a king over Israel, who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam that day. So your successor is the one that's going to make your seed completely disappear. But what? Even now, he says. In other words, it's already begun. For the Lord shall smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he shall root up Israel out of this good land which he gave to their fathers, and shall scatter them beyond the river, because they've made their groves, provoking the Lord to anger. It's a pretty powerful prophecy of the scattering of Israel, which is what's going to happen with those northern tribes. In verse 16, and he shall give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, who did sin, that's bad enough, and who made Israel to sin. That's even worse. No man is an island, and especially if you're the leader here, your sin affected others and caused sin in them. And so you will be given up by God. Notice when he said, I will give Israel up, he didn't say, I will give up on Israel. God never does that. But because you've removed me, you've expelled me, then I can't be here to help you against your enemies. And so, of course, as you are given up into their hands, they will do with you as seemeth them good. And that's the scattering. Thankfully, however, there will also be a gathering. Most of the rest of the Old Testament, by the way, spoiler alert, is all about scattering and gathering Israel. And so, of course, I did not give up on you, even when I gave you up. Jeroboam's son then dies, as prophesied. The moment his mother, can you imagine the hurt in her heart? We don't know anything about Sister Jeroboam, Mrs. Jeroboam. Was she righteous? Maybe. Did she love her son? Undoubtedly. Do I stay away and never come home and just hope that he lives there without me? Well, whatever, she comes and he dies, as was promised. He's mourned as promised. He's buried properly as promised. And then verse 19, and the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred, how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. Now, that's not our books of Chronicles. Those were their chronicles that they would just record things, and that becomes some of the source material for what we have in the books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. But they would write these things down. And that's kind of the pattern that they followed. Let's talk about their wars and their reign. You see that pattern in verse 20. And the days which Jeroboam reigned were 22 years. So they'll usually give you the length of their reign. And he slept with his fathers, and Nadab his son reigned in his stead. So then they'll explain the successor, and then they'll kind of give their history. Although usually they'll switch back and forth between north and south. It's like kind of ping pong. And here's the king of Israel up in the north, and here's his life and his reign and his wars, and then he died, and he passes the baton to his successor. Meanwhile, down south, here's this king, and then we'll shift back to theirs, and then rewind to the beginning of their reign, and then tell the whole story. And then say, oh, and then they died, and this is how long they reigned, and this is their successor. And meanwhile, back in the northern kingdom, and it's just, like I said, ping pong back and forth. But that's the general pattern. Then verse 21, as we switch back south, and Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord did choose out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. Again, that's the temple. Temple site, temple city, city of Zion, city of David, city of God. That's what Jerusalem is. But despite having a temple there, the real one, the inconvenient one, verse 22, Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they had committed, above all that their fathers had done. Society is getting worse, not better. Some who had it harder are coming down to Jerusalem to be close. Some who already had it easier are turning away from the house of God and making their own lives worse. The verse goes on, for they also built them high places and images and groves on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also sodomites in the land. In that case, those would be male prostitutes, they're often involved in fertility cults at some of these pagan shrines. And they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. Now look back at that list. They're doing the same kinds of things that the nations around them were doing. The nations before them had done the very things that got those nations kicked out of the promised land. To clear the way, the land spewed out the wicked, as we saw that great verb earlier, and made the way for God's chosen people to come into his promised land. Well, can you not predict the future based on what he's just said? If you do the same things that got the unchosen people kicked out, then the chosen people will get kicked out too. And that's going to be the scattering of Israel in the north and the destruction by the Babylonians in the south. It's all written on the wall here because of what they did spiritually to themselves. And again, this is in Judah now, where you'd think you've got no excuse. You have real Levites and priests. You have real priesthood. You have the temple of God right there in your own territory. Sadly, they opted for man-made high places when they could have ascended the mountain of the Lord. They opted for worship in groves that weren't sacred. They went to worship under every green tree when they could have had the tree of life and partaken of its fruit. What a tragedy that they bowed before graven images when they could have had the image of God engraven upon their countenance. It was right before them, but they didn't live into that. In verse 25, it came to pass in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. Now, there always seems to be wars and rumors of wars all around them, but this time from Egypt? Wait a minute, Rehoboam, your own father, remember when we saw his first political marriage listed was with the Egyptians? That's like your stepmom? This is, you'd think that an alliance based in marriage would last longer than one generation, but that is all it lasted. Lets you know that Solomon, your political wisdom maybe wasn't quite as savvy as you thought, because your earthly alliances didn't do much. Your eternal ones could have, if you had trusted in God instead. In verse 26, as the Egyptians come and conquer, he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He even took away all. And he took away all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. In the New Testament, we'll see the Lord talk about thieves breaking in and stealing from a house when the master isn't home to stop them. And that seems to be the case in the temple. As the Egyptians come and ransack treasures from the temple, because the Lord isn't in his house, he hasn't felt welcome there, since people are going to other places to worship. Even the phrase about taking away the shields of gold, there's a loss of the shield of faith there in Judah. In verse 27, King Rehoboam made in their stead brazen shields, and committed them unto the hands of the chief of the guard, which kept the door of the king's house. Well, at least we got some shields still. Well, yeah, but brass or bronze is a far cry from gold. And sadly, this is a pretty good personification or embodiment, metaphor, for what's happening in Israel, that things are diminishing in spiritual worth. And we're losing these shields of faith. And even when we try to replace them, it's with something of inferior quality that isn't going to stand the test of time. In verse 28 then, and it was so, when the king went into the house of the Lord, that the guard bare them and brought them back into the guard chamber. Now, I don't know for sure exactly what it meant by the king went into the house of the Lord. Is this just into the courts? Because a king can go there, that's okay. If, and again, I don't know this for sure, but if he's going into the house of the Lord, like inside, into the holy place, then that's a problem, since he's from Judah and not from Levi. And if that's the case, what does that suggest about the temple? I mean, if a king can just step into places where not even he is worthy or welcome, has the temple just descended into some kind of, again, public works project and public space? Is it like an art museum, or in this case, a spiritual museum, where we keep a few religious relics, but the fire of God is no longer truly burning bright? That does seem to be indicative of what's happening in Judah, just like what was happening north in Israel. Finally, chapter ends, 29 and 30. Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, it's like, are we tired of his story already? I kind of am. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all their days, which means this is civil war. Division where there should have been unity. And I imagine the three kings of united Israel, those that had an untorn cloak with all 12 pieces, Saul, David, and Solomon, are probably turning over in their graves. Either that or chastising themselves for not doing a little bit better than they did. Chapter 15, then, we continue to see both righteousness and wickedness in the reigns of the kings as we ping-pong back and forth between north and south. In the south, in Judah, the next king is Abijam, who's the son of Rehoboam. So grandson of Solomon, great-grandson of David, great-great-grandson of Jesse, and you can keep going from there. Comes from good stock, at least you'd think. But verse 3, he walked in all the sins of his father, which he had done before him. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Parents, be careful about your influence. What kind of example are we passing down? If we make our hearts a little more perfect with the Lord, will our children stand a better chance to have their hearts in the right place too? In verse 4, nevertheless, for David's sake did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem, to set up his son after him, and to establish Jerusalem, because David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. I wish we could keep that verse without the last phrase. But it's still there, at least here in the King's version, haunting us. David lived a near perfect life. And it was such that God would preserve an heir on the throne from his own posterity. A light will remain, a lamp there in Jerusalem. I'm not going to snuff it out like Jeroboam's light is about to be snuffed after one generation. No, David deserved better than that, because he lived better than that. But that one mistake, I hope we realize that it's not just the quantity of the good or bad that we do, but the quality and the severity of our sins will make a huge difference. So we need to guard against them. In the Chronicles version of this story, by the way, in 2 Chronicles 13:18, when Judah was under Abijah, or that's how it's spelled in the Chronicles. Abijam is how it's spelled here in Kings. Either spelling, this king of Judah is fighting Jeroboam. And it says, thus the children of Israel were brought under at that time, and the children of Judah prevailed because they relied upon the Lord God of their fathers. Oh, that's good to know. There were still some righteous people in Judah. Maybe they're the ones that left Israel because of the problems they saw up north, and they'd be more motivated to fight the north than any. Like, we can't let their kind of apostasy creep down in here, even though we're seeing that happen. There were those sufficient in the south to be able to push back the northern invaders because they relied upon the God of their fathers. Now, Abijam's son is the next king of Judah, and his name is Asa. And he's one worth remembering. Abijam only got a couple of verses, okay? But Asa is awesome. It's interesting that, as we've said before, sometimes kids are good because of their parents, and sometimes they're good despite their parents. And sometimes kids aren't so good because of their parents, and sometimes they're not so good despite their parents. In this case, you get an amazing son raised by a not-so-faithful father. And Asa is a king that's worth remembering and worth studying here. So despite his father's negative example, verse 11, Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father. Or what would this be? His great-great-grandfather? Did I get the number of greats right? The beauty of this is that we all have both positive and negative examples to look to in our own family tree. And branches that needed to be pruned or trimmed a bit, and others that just we want to give full flower to. Well, take your pick. And if they say that in every family line there are both heroes and horse thieves, then follow the heroes and pray for forgiveness for the horse thieves. Learn from the best and the worst examples that you can and choose which ones you'll follow. And that's what Asa is doing. And what did Asa do right? The Chronicles version gives us more insight into that. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 1 and 2. And the Spirit of God came upon Azariah, the son of Oded. So here's another prophet that we don't know anything about, okay? But his ministry intersects with the reign of the king. He went out to meet Asa and said unto him, hear ye me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. So the two scraps that are still in your cloak. The Lord is with you while ye be with him. And if ye seek him, he will be found of you. But if ye forsake him, he will forsake you. I love how crystal clear this prophet spells it out to this new king reigning in Judah. Choice is yours. God wants to be with you. Do you want him here? Because you'll either find him if you seek him, or scare him off through your bad behaviors. Keep going in that chapter. 2 Chronicles 15, 3 and 4. Now for a long season Israel hath been without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. Now, I don't know a better description for a general apostasy than that. God has been expelled from his kingdom, kicked out of his own house. There's no teaching priest, and a teaching priest would be a prophet who goes about teaching the law, helping people judge better how they're supposed to be living, crying repentance, just so that what this teaching priest is doing. There just haven't been many of them. And without law, this is a lawless state. People are just doing their own thing. We saw that back in the book of Judges, right, during the Pride Cycle rounds, that there was no king in Israel. People would just do whatever was right in their own eyes. Well, now there is a king, but it's not helping any. During the period of general apostasy, then, notice the next verse, and this is one that I hope will soften our view of the great apostasy between the time of Christ and the time of the restoration. I think too often we paint that so dark in terms of dark ages, just to make the restoration's light shine even more brilliantly. It doesn't need that kind of help. And it's not historically accurate, and it's not kind or fair to the righteous people that lived through the apostasy and kept the fires of faith burning, at least on the individual level. And even on the collective, as far as maintaining Christianity, keeping the Old and New Testaments alive and well, for example. Nourishing the woman even when she was off in the wilderness of apostasy, if you remember those lessons that we've had. Because notice the next verse. 2 Chronicles 15, verse 4. I don't know a better verse to help us navigate apostasy. But when they in their trouble did turn unto the Lord God of Israel and sought him, he was found of them. That speaks so beautifully of God's presence during the apostasy, when we tend to only focus on his absence. God did not take the open sign and turn it around to closed. He didn't just shut off the lights and turn in for a millennium and a half. No, he was still there answering prayers and performing miracles. And yes, inspiring righteous men and women to keep the church alive. Not with all of its authority, not institutionally to the point of having prophets and apostles that were receiving revelation for the whole and recording it in Scripture. Throughout Jewish and Christian history, whenever there are prophets, they have written things down. And so anytime the Scripture isn't being expanded upon, anytime there aren't prophets and apostles revealing the Word of God, something's off. I'm grateful every 6 months we have a reminder that it's not off. So yes, there was an institutional apostasy, but as far as God's individual presence in people's lives, if they turned to him, he was there to be found. And that's true of our own individual apostasies too. We turn away from him, we lose him, his presence in our lives, but we turn back and he's waiting to come running to any returning prodigal. I know that. Keep going in this chapter. 2 Chronicles 15 is one that it deserves to be elevated and kept right alongside because it adds so much additional information we're missing in 1 Kings. So here's verse 7 and 8. This prophet continues speaking to King Asa. Be ye strong, therefore, and let not your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded. You can end this apostasy as soon as you decide to. Your efforts will pay off. This reform that you're engaged in, keep it up, King Asa. And when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Oded the prophet, and yes, there's some confusion there. Is it coming from Azariah? Is it coming from his father Oded? It doesn't matter. Either way, he took courage and put away the abominable idols out of all the land of Judah and Benjamin, and out of the cities which he had taken from Mount Ephraim, and renewed the altar of the Lord that was before the porch of the Lord. Even the temple of Solomon's altar had fallen into disrepair. The altar up north cracked in half under Jeroboam. Well, under Rehoboam, it was having some issues as well. And so to see Asa changing things, renewing things, putting things away that his father had allowed to creep into the kingdom. This is a beautiful reform. Keep going in verse 9. And he gathered all Judah and Benjamin and the strangers with them out of Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh, there's Lehi's ancestors. They're gathered in by a righteous King Asa. Come and be with us. He gathers them out of Ephraim, Manasseh, Simeon, for they fell to him out of Israel in abundance when they saw that the Lord his God was with him. I said before that the temple is the ultimate magnet for righteous people that are willing to be self-sacrificial to the point of coming. That has things I can't find anywhere else, so I will drop anything and come. If that's one magnet, righteous leadership is another one. And these people from throughout the northern tribes of Israel are seeing there's something different in King Asa. Judah has a king unlike the kings of Israel. And so I want to follow him. And whether we use this as an example of conversion or of reactivation, your righteousness will do so much to draw in disciples who are trying to be like Jesus. In verse 12 and 13, one more thing to add from 2 Chronicles 15. And they entered into a covenant to seek the Lord God of their fathers with all their heart and with all their soul, that whosoever would not seek the Lord God of Israel should be put to death, whether small or great, whether man or woman. Talk about a complete rejection of iniquity. They're serious about this. Capital crimes, deserving capital punishment under the law of their day, and they're going to be just. They are going to keep the commandments of God. With the help of 2 Chronicles 15, then, we're ready to go back to 1 Kings and make a little bit more sense of the next verse. In verse 12 and 13, Asa's reform, he took away the Sodomites out of the land. He removed all the idols that his fathers had made. So we're removing temptation. We're getting rid of evil influence. We got a zero tolerance policy. And also Maacah, his mother, even her, he removed from being queen. because she had made an idol in a grove. And Asa destroyed her idol and burnt it by the brook Kidron. I love the fact that Asa wouldn't even make an exception for his own mom, because she was going against the God of his fathers. You remember that talk from Elder Uchtdorf, the God of our, or faith of our father? Not faith of our fathers, which is how we usually hear the phrase. He talked about that too. His fathers were Lutheran. But his father, capital F, Heavenly Father, had a faith far more encompassing. The fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The plan of salvation of our God. And that was the faith Elder Uchtdorf wanted to espouse. Regardless of what that meant in terms of keeping up with family tradition. For Asa, Mom, love you. What you did, you cannot be in a position of influence if that's the kind of influence you are going to wield. And so she's removed from being queen. And then the idol she's been worshiping before is burnt in the brook Kidron. The brook Kidron, by the way, keep an eye out for that, because the brook Kidron that flows through the Kidron Valley is where the Garden of Gethsemane is in the New Testament. And I can't help but think of that symbolism, that if you have idols that need to be removed from your life, where's the best place to make them go up in smoke? The Garden of Gethsemane. Hand them over to Jesus, and he will turn evil into ash, and then ash into beauty. That's what the atonement does. The Chronicles version then adds this detail for chapter 15, verse 15. All Judah rejoiced at the oath. Do we find joy in our covenants? They did. For they had sworn with all their heart and sought him with their whole desire. And he was found of them. And the Lord gave them rest round about. He was found. That was the promise. If you'll seek me, you'll find me. They sought and they found. Despite widespread apostasy all around them, if you want me to be in your life, I will come running. And then the other half, rest roundabout, despite wars and rumors of wars from all directions. Asa's reign was a time of righteousness, and thus it could be a time of peace. It wasn't always. There were times that he had to fight back and reestablish peace, but he did it whenever he could. Now, verse 14, it wasn't perfect, but the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect with the Lord all his days. So not perfect implementation, he wasn't flawless, but his heart was in the right place, and that's what God is after. Then verse 16, we're still in the King's version. And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. We'll meet Baasha a little bit more in depth at the end of the chapter. And Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might not suffer any to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. You see, the same problem that existed during Jeroboam's reign of the righteous fleeing Israel to go down to Judah. It's happening even more in Asa's reign, because things are better under Asa than they were under his predecessors. And so here's the new king of Israel up north saying, I got to stop this. I need to create some kind of barrier to keep people from leaving. And it's interesting to watch. Social media does a lot of that in terms of trying to convince people who desire to make a change and return to faith, trying to create some kind of barrier against that. No, haven't you heard this? And haven't you read this? And didn't you realize this? And it's like, I'm missing God, and I found him on that side. And so if you could please get out of the way and quit throwing things into my face and just allow me to go back to the faith of my father, please, thank you. Well, Baasha doesn't want that to happen, so he's trying to build this city that's going to act as a barrier to keep people from leaving. And so Asa, who at this point is a little concerned, I don't know if I can beat the Israelites on my own, he reaches out to the king of Syria and says, hey, can we make an alliance, and would you be able to help us fight back against the Israelites so that we can tear down this barrier that they're building? And sure enough, Syria agrees. Looks like, Syria is always bouncing back and forth between north and south. Which side should we be on? Are we going to fight against? We don't like either one of you, but if the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then great. I'll switch allegiance whenever it's best for me. And that's what Syria does at this time. They, sure enough, fight against the Israelites. The Israelites lose. Asa is fine. They are victorious, and they tear down Rabbah. But And then the king's story ends there. The Chronicles version, though, adds a little bit of insight into the aftermath of that event. So go back to 2 Chronicles 16 and start in verse 7. At that time, Hanani the seer, here's another prophet we don't know anything about, came to Asa, king of Judah, and said unto him, Because thou hast relied on the king of Syria, and not relied on the Lord thy God, therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand. Were not the Ethiopians and the Lubims, other enemies, a huge host with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet, because thou didst rely on the Lord, he delivered them into thine hand. And Asa, he would have done the same in this case if you'd fully trusted in him. Why did you trust in the arm of flesh when the arm of God has never failed you? See, Asa is a good, righteous, wonderful king, but he's human. And ironically, even though the chronicler is usually the one to give us a sanitized version, he's the one that points out the flaws in Asa here. You should have relied on God. Why did you rely on the king of Syria? In fact, Syria is an enemy. You should be fighting them at some point, not joining their side. He goes on in verse 9, For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. Herein thou hast done foolishly, therefore from henceforth thou shalt have wars. And though he typically won them, Asa did have to fight and defend his people. He had to, maybe the Lord was trying to teach him and reteach him, trust me every time you find yourself in harm's way. And Asa does a better job of that. But I love the way it's phrased. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth. God is always on the lookout for people who need him and who are crying out for his help in righteousness, in faith, instead of the ones that never raise the voice and ask for his assistance. Oh, no, I got this. Or there's other sources, and I'm just going to do this myself, or trust in the arm of flesh. No. He's on the lookout for those, even in periods of apostasy, as we've seen. He's looking for faithful souls that are asking for help. Then he can give it to them. In verse 10, then this is added. Asa was wroth with the seer. Uh-oh. I thought you were better than this, Asa. Well, not on this day. He didn't take his correction very well, kind of the way Rehoboam had acted. Maybe there's a little challenge in that, in the family genes. He put him in a prison house, for he was in a rage with him because of this thing. And Asa oppressed some of the people at the same time. I don't want to lose complete faith in Asa here, because he had such an amazing beginning. But like David, like Saul, like David, like Solomon before him, his beginning was better than his end. And it's interesting what happens when we lose the Spirit. It changes us. It was the Spirit that was changing us in the better direction. Without it, it's back to natural man. And here, he's angry with the correction. He's in a rage, throws him in prison. He's oppressing other people at the same time. His loss of the Spirit is damaging relationships everywhere we look. And the same happens with us. We need the Spirit in our lives so that we can treat other people kindly, so that we are humble enough to take correction, so we don't oppress people that we're supposed to be leading in love. Sadly, it doesn't change. Verse 12, at the end of Asa's reign, he was diseased in his feet, until his disease was exceeding great. But then this last detail, yet in his disease he sought not to the Lord, but to the physicians. So there he is, still putting his trust in the arm of flesh, maybe too stubborn to realize he'd been wrong when he was corrected by this man of God. And instead of humbly accepting that correction and changing, no, he doubles down like Rehoboam had. He pushes back like Rehoboam had. And it ends up costing him. Now, there's nothing wrong with turning to the physicians. Don't get me wrong. I'm grateful. I turn to the physicians all the time, more often than I wish I had to. But I always turn to the Lord in the midst of all of that. You turn to both, best case scenario. And then Asa dies. The throne passes to his son, Jehoshaphat, and we'll learn more about him at the end of today's lesson. He is one of my absolute favorite forgotten kings of Israel. Saul, David, Solomon we know well. Hopefully we know Hezekiah and Josiah. We'll meet them in 2 weeks, I believe. But the two that I really want to resurrect based on this week's study is Asa and Jehoshaphat. And sure enough, those are the ones that we get almost nothing about in Kings, and whole chapters about in Chronicles. So just to resurrect those two men, studying Chronicles is worth your time. Okay, we'll do it together. Meanwhile, we've shifted from south to north. We saw what Asa was doing down in Judah. Now let's go back to what's happening up north in Israel. The throne of Israel then passed from Jeroboam to his son Nadab. He's not the son that died and received a proper burial. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You know what's going to happen to this one? Well, sure enough, he's committing the same kinds of sins that his father Jeroboam was guilty of, until one of his own men, Baasha, who we met earlier, conspired against him and killed him to be able to take over the throne. And then, just as prophesied, Baasha goes and wipes out all of Jeroboam's posterity until there is no one left, exactly as the prophet Ahijah had said. And with that, we shift to chapter 16 to see what's going on up north. Like I said, we keep bouncing back and forth between southern Judah and northern Israel to see what's happening. We're now on Israel's turn. And this is a sad chapter, but it sets the stage for the glorious second half of today's lesson where we get to hang out with Elijah. Okay, it's so good. So chapter 16, verse 1 and 2. Then the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani. Here's another prophet we know nothing about. Against Baasha. There's that king of Israel after the insurrection. Saying, for as much as I exalted thee out of the dust, and made thee prince over my people Israel, and thou hast walked in the way of Jeroboam, and hast made my people Israel to sin, to provoke me to anger with their sins, behold, I will take away the posterity of Baasha, and the posterity of his house, and will make thy house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now in those three verses, we see the same problem that happened earlier with Jeroboam, where God says to him through a prophet, I didn't pick you as a replacement to be no better than the thing you replaced. I called you to be someone better. And here's the same thing with Baasha. Even though you conspired and rebelled and took over the throne from the house of Jeroboam, I was trying to turn the tide. I was trying to give them a fresh start, a new beginning, but you're falling back into the same bad habits. You're no better than the thing you replaced. So it shouldn't have been you to replace them. Sure enough, the same thing that happened to them will happen to you, and your household is going to be wiped off the map. In a way, God is saying, you didn't learn justice when you were administering it to the house of Jeroboam. Maybe you'll learn it when justice is being administered to you. So let's see how it feels when you're on the receiving end. Baasha doesn't last long. The throne is passed to his son Elah, but he doesn't last long either. One of the military commanders there in Israel, his name is Zimri. Sorry for all the names. There's no quiz at the end, don't worry. He conspires against him, just like Baasha had done. Okay, is it starting to be poetic justice here, or poetic injustice in this case? Zimri fights against the king, kills him, takes the throne, wipes out Baasha's entire family. If this is sounding familiar, it's because it is. That's how things are going up north. But Zimri, this captain, his reign only lasts 7 days. King for a week. And what a week it was, because the people wouldn't accept him. I mean, would you? The northern society is falling apart, where it's not even, at best, it's going father to son, like one link. That's it. Father to son, and then somebody comes and usurps the throne. Hands it to his son, somebody else comes and usurps the throne. Is there any dynasty that's going to last? Apparently not. But after 7 days of rejection from the people, they turn to another chief captain. His name is Omri, and Omri goes to attack Zimri. Zimri finds out about it, is scared to death, so holds himself up in the royal palace and lights it on fire and allows it to burn down on top of him, ending his own reign. I guess Omri will have to rebuild. But he does now take over the kingdom. And his will actually last a little while longer. He's the new king of Israel. Unfortunately, he's no better than any of his predecessors. In fact, he's considerably worse. In verse 25, Omri wrought evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all that were before him. Some things you don't want to be famous for, but that's Omri's claim to fame. Well, he couldn't claim the kingdom for long before the story takes it to his successor, his own son, a man named Ahab. And here's the one we're going to be spending some quality time with. He becomes the arch nemesis of our hero Elijah in the second half of today's lesson. But you see him in verse 30, Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Oh, you mean he broke his father's record? Unfortunately, yes. This is northern society in absolute free fall. Things are falling apart all around them. They went from pretty good with Jeroboam till he turned things away, and then went from good to bad, from bad to worse, from worse to the worst, and then from somebody somehow that was worse than the worst. Where's this thing going to end up? Well, with someone needing to come and cry repentance. And it's going to be someone of the caliber of an Elijah. And why was Ahab so awful, so wicked? Notice the description in 31 and 32. It came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. So as if idolatry and high places and false prophets and false priests and absolute apostasy weren't bad enough, then let's add insult to injury with this next part. He took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians. And that may have been his worst mistake of all. Because as we'll see in the subsequent chapters, she seems to be the puppet master pulling Ahab's strings. He was bad. She made him worse. And we'll see that. They went and served Baal and worshipped him. He reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. This is no mere gradual spiritual decline. This is not drifting off into inactivity. It's not dwindling in unbelief. This is in your face, throw it before you, provoke the God of Israel to anger. This is cut down the tree of life and plant groves, the unsacred kind, in their place. This is replace the Lord of hosts with a Lord named Baal. That's what Baal means, a new Lord, a new master. Let's forget the house of God and build a house of Baal. And let's just bring it on. Let's throw it in God's face and get people to side with us instead of him. With that kind of bold opposition, no wonder God will call the boldest of prophets. Because a king on the level of an Ahab, a queen on the level of a Jezebel, will require a prophet on the level of an Elijah to face them.